All right, we now welcome on legendary North Carolina sports radio host David Glenn. David, how we doing?
I'm doing great, Carter. Good to be with you.
Appreciate it. So let's start this off. Tell people about how you got into sports radio. You started out as a lawyer, right?
It's a weird story. I guess the long story short is when I was coming out of college, there was no such thing as 24-hour sports radio in the state of North Carolina.
Hmm.
There were sports radio shows, but there were not yet 24-hour sports radio stations the way we see all over the place, not just in North Carolina, but around the country now. So I came from a newspaper-oriented generation. I got a journalism degree with the idea of being a sports writer and or sports editor. So that was the track that I was on. And as a young person, even a college student, I contributed to the Washington Post and the New York Times, and I did a lot of work in North Carolina for the Durham Herald Sun newspaper. So I was just kind of continuing my original vision of being in sports, but the writing and editing side of things. And I had only done a few little tidbits with radio and television. And then after becoming an attorney, as you said, I got the best sports media job offer of my life in the same year that I was building my legal career. So I was thinking to myself, where was this offer 4 years ago before I busted my tail for 3 hours with the thickest textbooks I had ever seen in my life, and went through the grueling challenge of passing the bar exam on my first try. Where was this sports offer then? Well, I decided to take that. It was writing and editing, took that offer, and I just hoped as a young man in my mid-20s at that point, either my legal career would take off or my sports writing and editing career would take off. I didn't know if either one would. So I figured if you just try hard in both, one or the other will be your occupation and what pays the bills for your family. Well, when I created the ACC Sports Journal and ACCSports.com in the mid-90s, just as the internet was being born, there started to pop up 24-hour sports radio stations, and they needed guests. And not every famous coach can say yes every time, and not every famous athlete can say yes every time to these hosts for interview requests. So they often used media members. Well, I was the guy who created the ACC Sports Journal and ACCSports.com. So I would get phone calls from Charlotte and Raleigh and where these first stations popped up in North Carolina. And I would say, sure, I'll be your guest for 10 minutes by phone on the big game coming up or the last big game that happened or whatever else. And fast forward, some of these stations liked me so much as a phone guest for their regular hosts that they said, have you ever thought about being a sports radio host yourself? And my honest answer, and I'm a very transparent guy, I said, no. And they said, have you studied to be a radio guy? I said, no, I studied law and journalism. Are you interested in trying to be a sports radio guy? Well, maybe, but I can't leave these other jobs that I've been doing for quite a while now. So I originally started a once a week Saturday morning show just to see, would they like me as much as they thought they would as a host, which is a lot different, as you know, than being a guest. Being a guest is easy. Being a host is a lot harder. And the once a week Saturday morning show also allowed me to keep my law practice, keep my roles as editor and lead writer for the ACC Sports Journal and ACCSports.com, keep all the freelance writing I was doing, because it was once a week, a couple hours.
Mm-hmm.
So I dove into radio, not all that good at it as a host at the time. And they liked me so much that when a full-time job came open, they asked me if I wanted it. I did that for a while. Somebody else came along and said, we really like what you're doing in the Triangle. How about doing it on a statewide basis? And that's the, I guess, not so short story of how a young journalist and lawyer came to have as his biggest paycheck for the last 21 years in a row, sports radio, which was not an industry I envisioned, not the industry I studied for, not the industry I dreamed of, not the industry I planned for. But that's how life works sometimes. And in my case, I'm certainly glad that it did.
So when you're doing law and you finally go into a full-time sports radio host, how much more fun is your job?
I am one of those who enjoyed being an attorney, in my case, for 17 years. And I held on to that in part because I liked it so much for so long. But in the bigger picture, on the proverbial 100-point scale, even the joy of being an attorney and helping some of my clients with really important life issues and circumstances, that was not going to be as high on that 100-point scale as some of my buddies who are still my friends from growing up in Philadelphia 40 years ago. They'll say, DG, man, no, even if you have an unreasonable boss, even if you have an unruly guest on live radio who blew up your show that day, even if you get negative feedback sometimes on social media or personal attacks from unhappy fans, you're never allowed to complain because you get paid to write and talk about sports for a living. And, they have more traditional jobs and they're like, we don't get paid to write and talk about sports for a living. So your worst day might be as good as some of our better days. So I took that to heart, and the pluses infinitely outweigh the minuses, of course. But yeah, the fun factor, the work factor is high, but the fun factor is also really high. And the old saying, if you're doing something that you love, it doesn't feel like work nearly as often, if at all. And I'm 34 years into getting paid to write and talk about sports, with the latter portion of that mostly radio. And I count my blessings every day because I do always try to remind myself of that big picture. My own brother says he's not sure he's ever found any occupation that he is passionate about, and he's almost 50 years old. And yet I'm not sure I've had many days of work in my whole life, at least since I was a teenager, working at Burger King. I don't think I've had many days in the last 35 years where I was not excited to go to work that day. And, that's something that I would wish for anyone. And that is a blessing that I do not take for granted.
So what was your favorite interview or moment during the show?
Oh, there are a lot of them. My favorite big picture experience is just the people.
Mm-hmm.
So I had 3 different producers for 5 years each. Their names were Jared Brooks, Hayes Permar, and these most recent 5 years, Darren Vaught. They all became good friends of mine. I mean, your producer in sports radio is your professional equivalent of a spouse. And I'm not even exaggerating. You probably spend more time in person and on the phone with your producer than you do with your spouse. And for better or for worse, that's how it works. So between those friendships, Darren Vaught to this moment is one of my best friends in the world. Those business relationships, but also generations of interns that not only in some cases the older ones are good friends of mine, but in many cases I helped them toward a legal career, a business career, a TV career, a writing career, a radio career. When you can be just a small piece of those personal journeys, where I always say they deserve the overwhelming majority of the credit, no matter how large or small a piece of their puzzle I might have been, or we as a show might have been, there is a joy to that personal element that is the most fun of anything that I've experienced in my professional career. In terms of interviews, I'd probably say the starting point would be when President Barack Obama joined the show live. That was in the aftermath of Dean Smith's death, the legendary UNC basketball coach. Mm-hmm. We had seen the president put out on official White House stationery his condolences and his words of reflection on the late, great Dean Smith. And I said to my staff, if Coach Smith's death is important enough for President Obama to put that out on stationery, they don't do that for every famous person who dies. He, of course, a Michael Jordan fan, a Chicago guy, Obama, a huge Bulls fan, and he is aware of the college basketball history and the Dean Smith-Michael Jordan connection. So I said, of course it's a long shot. It's like asking the prettiest girl you've ever seen, will you go out on a date with me? I mean, odds are she's going to say no, but you're not sure until you ask, right? So we used some back channels and even a couple of personal connections. Reggie Love, the former Duke player, worked for Obama.
That was going to be my question, is how in the world did you get that to happen?
So one connection was Reggie, who had been a guest on our show, and it never hurts to have people say nice things about you. He had a positive experience as a lower profile guest on the David Glenn show. And somewhere in the chain of things, I'm sure his words mattered. Mm-hmm. My producer at the time, Hayes Permar, the guy I mentioned earlier, also had a personal contact that was somewhere in the White House sort of public relations chain of command. Mm-hmm. So you have Reggie Love vouching for us. You have this personal connection vouching for us. You had us being able to offer not just a media outlet, but the largest sports radio show ever done between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, mm-hmm. we were everywhere in North Carolina, plus parts of Virginia and South Carolina. So if the topic is Dean Smith, and if they placed a phone call to UNC, they would say, yeah, David interviewed Dean Smith one-on-one back in the 1980s and 1990s. And he has a huge platform. If you're going to do one interview, it might as well be with that guy. Mm-hmm. So we had all these folks advocating on our behalf. And our 1 out of 10 long shot, or at best, came to fruition, and it was really a wonderful interview where, of course, we avoided politics. It was about sports and basketball and his respect and admiration for Dean Smith and the Michael Jordan connection and even the Reggie Love connection. So we had a lot of fun. And, I mean, you know, there aren't that many people who have interviewed multiple United States presidents, you know, world-renowned writers like John Grisham and Stephen King, who are both big sports fans, in addition to best-selling authors, entertainers like Brooklyn Decker, the supermodel and actress, and Adam Sandler and Kevin James and other actors, plus, you know, probably, in my case, hundreds of elite sports figures. Mm-hmm. You might have interviewed multiple presidents or multiple entertainers or multiple sports figures, but maybe not all of those things. And over 34 years, we built up a heck of a guest list, and United States presidents, I guess, just by occupation, belong somewhere near the top of that list.
Did you get nervous before those?
I can't say I was nervous for those. I was honestly more nervous on my first show as a host, mm-hmm. way back in 20 plus years ago, than I was with any famous person. I even as a younger man, I was a believer in the old saying, everybody puts on their jockstrap the same way. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of variations of that, but a person is a person. And in everyday life, I try to treat people who are not famous or powerful or well-known with the same dignity and respect and hopefully positivity that I would treat the famous person. I don't think somebody's inherently better than somebody else just because they're more famous or more wealthy or more well-known. So I'm not easily intimidated. I just try to view it as person to person. And I think part of the reason that I'm mostly relaxed, some of it is getting older and just not being as anxious about anything. But part of it is preparation. And whether you are going into an exam as a student or get ready to give a best man speech at a wedding reception, or interviewing the President of the United States or John Grisham or Michael Jordan or somebody else, if you've prepared, by definition, you should be less anxious. Now, not everybody is even keeled, so very few people aren't nervous at all. But if you've prepared, whatever your personal nerve factor is should be chopped by 80%. Heck, if I was giving a best man speech and hadn't done any thought or preparation beforehand, I'd be nervous. If I was interviewing you or the President of the United States and I didn't do any preparation before time, I would be nervous. Mm-hmm. But when you do your homework, the test might still be a little nerve-wracking, but not as much. And that big name interview might still create some butterflies, but there's just no reason to be shaking because you have set yourself up for success rather than setting yourself up for a potential train wreck, which is what happens in life a lot of the time if you fail to prepare.
All right, let's transition a little bit. We're less than a week away. We're in the greatest month of the year from the ACC tournament, back in its rightful place in Greensboro. I know there's only going to be 15% of fans in there, but it's the best place to hold the ACC tournament. Do you enjoy the relocation of the ACC tournament?
I'm okay with it, but I understand the arguments on both sides. Given that I'm originally from Philadelphia, I am not as attached because I didn't grow up in ACC country. I am not as attached to what many will describe as their appreciation for way back. It was in Raleigh, not allowed anymore because you can't have it on a team's home court. But Raleigh, many years, Charlotte, as you know, many years, Greensboro, as you know, many, many years, including Charlotte and Greensboro, even in the current rotation. I came to the point where as a young journalist, I would hear enough complaints from Gary Williams at Maryland back in the day. He would say, yeah, we're up here in Alaska in College Park, Maryland, because he felt when he visited North Carolina, it would be complaints about the North Carolina refs and the North Carolina home court advantage.
We get the same complaints from Jim Boeheim today. So
you got it. So it's everything from the refs to the fans to shorter drives and sometimes sleeping in your own beds rather than having to get on an airplane the way Miami or Notre Dame these days or Boston College, et cetera, would have to, headed to one of these tournaments held in North Carolina. So I got to the point where when the ACC expanded to the monstrosity that it is now at 15 schools, it was 8 when I started covering it. I just heard from enough fans and heard enough valid arguments about them wanting and deserving at least the occasional trip to New York City, which I enjoy. My wife is from there. DC, I thought was pretty fun every once in a while. Atlanta has been a good host at times. Some of the others not quite as successful. Tampa, I remember asking residents if they even knew the ACC tournament was there, and for the most part, they had no idea that it was there. So I think in my heart, I share your and others' appreciation. I'm happy when it's in Greensboro and Charlotte. I'm never disappointed. But one of my favorite quotes of all time is variety is the spice of life. I think that's true with food and travel and friendship and a lot of other things. I think it's become true with the ACC tournament. So I like the variety, but I am also glad that at least half the time it's back where it was born, right here in the great state of North Carolina.
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to be at 2018 in Brooklyn when Duke played Carolina. And I've been to a couple Duke Carolina games in my life. That was the most dead game I've ever been to. It was so disappointing. And then next year, I know Zion was playing in 2019 in Charlotte.
Yeah.
That was the most electric ACC game I've ever been to. And it's just disappointing because it just belongs in North Carolina, man. Like, it just does. I know you want to get the exposure and Jim Boeheim's going to whine and whatnot, but I've been to DC too. DC wasn't bad because Virginia fans travel extremely well.
Yeah.
But when it's in Greensboro, it feels different. And maybe that's just me because I have the attachment to there. But you've been to the ones in Greensboro, right?
Oh, for sure. Many times.
Different, right?
You're not wrong in terms of the way it's embraced by the community. As much as I enjoy New York City, if between my hotel and Barclays Center, I interviewed 100 strangers, probably 90 of them would not know that the ACC tournament is there. And the 10 who do might need reminders about, which schools make up the Atlantic Coast Conference. That's a little overgeneralizing, but you get the idea. Whereas in Greensboro, a significant percentage of the same on the sidewalk random encounters, or your waiter or waitress at the restaurant or your cab driver or whatever. The majority of people know that it's there, are glad that it is there, have some understanding, that there are 4 schools in North Carolina. This is the heart and soul of the Atlantic Coast Conference and has been since the 1950s. 4 out of 15 is different than 4 out of 8 back in the day, obviously, but it still matters. And these schools that have been in the league since its creation have a deeper, richer appreciation for the history of the tournament and the pageantry of it all than somebody who only joined the ACC within the last decade or so. So you're absolutely onto something. Greensboro is 1A in my book. Charlotte is 1B.
Yes, 100%.
And if 60% of the tournaments moving forward are still in one of those two places, and occasionally we get to rotate among those others we've discussed, I'm okay with that, because it is at its best when it is in Greensboro, North Carolina, of course, headquarters of the ACC as well. And it's also, we also have a pretty good argument that in terms of centrality, it helps. As much as those non-North Carolinians can complain from time to time, it's not like Virginia, Clemson, Virginia Tech doesn't have a lot of alums in North Carolina. And even those who are in Virginia or South Carolina, they have a shorter distance to travel and less expensive hotel rooms than they do in New York City. I can promise you that. So, there's a lot of pluses and minuses to weigh. And at some point, then ACC Commissioner John Swofford had to make happy his larger constituency. And part of that was rotating the ACC tournament.
So you mentioned it before with the whole conference realignment, having the Louisvilles and Syracuse and Pitts coming in and losing Maryland, which I thought was huge. How do you feel about conference realignment in the ACC?
It's one of those where, because I'm a businessman, I know that you can have a great idea, but if your financial model is threatened, you better be realistic about the financial repercussions of certain decisions. If I were an idealist, I loved it when it was an 8 or 9 team league. I do remember way back when I was a young journalist, the ACC was overwhelmingly not taken seriously as a football league. And I loved basketball. And it was the center of the college basketball universe almost every year, right? Just think, at the end of the 80s, Coach K's really building a monster at Duke. Dean Smith already was a national champion at Carolina. Jim Valvano had led the Wolfpack to a title in the earlier 80s. So you get to the early 90s, man, it's Duke winning in 91. It's the Devils going back-to-back in 92. It's Dean Smith in Carolina getting his second title in 93. So 3 years in a row. You want to talk about the center of the college basketball universe. There was no argument to the contrary. At that same time, the ACC had gone long stretches where, yes, Clemson won a national football title in the early 80s. Georgia Tech shared one in 1990. But for the most part, there would be years where only a couple ACC teams were even ranked in the final top 25 in college football. So you'd have 6 or 7 basketball teams, including national champions and Final Four participants and more All-American players than you can count and Hall of Fame coaches. And then in football season, it'd be there's occasionally exciting ACC story nationally, but otherwise it was mostly regional conversation around ACC football, and the rest of the country ignored it. So you, of course, know Florida State's edition was with football in mind. Later expansion and realignment were with football in mind. And I'll never forget the quote of former BC athletic director Gene DiFilippo, who said out loud what others had said privately. And he said, y'all know that TV money is a bigger deal in college sports than it's ever been, right? And he said, y'all know that TV money is now more than 80% football money and more like, 19% men's basketball and 1% all other sports combined. When he put those numbers to it, 80+% of TV money revolves around football. I think that caused, Gene Corrigan way back in the day as the ACC commissioner, John Swofford over this last 2+ decades. I think it made them feel it was a necessity to expand because football and money became that much more important just for your survival as a league. And when the Big Ten showed financial models to Maryland, many Maryland people did not want to leave. It was not in their heart, for the most part, all things being equal, they would have stayed, no doubt in my mind. But when the Big Ten was in the process of adding the Big Ten network, and the SEC added the SEC network, and the dollars started just getting even bigger and bigger, and the ACC started to slide. Used to be number one financially, and then it was started to slide down the ladder for various reasons, football and TV included. Maryland, of course, jumped to the Big Ten for those dollars mainly, and the ACC had to react at that point. So philosophically, is it my preference? No. But realistically, do I believe it was a necessity? Yes, I do.
So I don't think the one and done era has helped with this, but I feel like ever since the conference realignment as well, ACC conference games have become so much less intense. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're right. And I remember writing and talking at the time, most things in life are a trade-off, right? Mm-hmm. If you invest yourself at work to the 80-hour-a-week degree, something else is going to be given, right? It might be your spouse. It might be, if you're a parent, your relationship with your children. Something's got to give, because life is a series of trade-offs. And whereas the financial necessity required conference expansion, in my opinion, the downside, and we discussed it in the moment as these decisions were being voted on, was the watering down of a culture. There's just no doubt about it. When you play every other conference member every year in football and every other conference member twice a year in basketball, well, you know more fans of those schools personally. Some of them are in your own neighborhood. It was at the point where the diehard ACC fans, when I started as a young journalist, they would not only know the name of their own head coach and rotation players, of course, they might know the name of the head coach and the top 7 or 8 basketball players at each of the other 7 or 8 schools in the league. I mean, that's a lot of people, but it was such an intense, proud culture, especially in basketball, that it was not uncommon to go to games and remember that Clemson or some other opposing fan from the other times that you had seen them twice or 3 times a year. So when you go from 8 overtime to 15, of course, the rivalries cannot possibly mean as much. The games cannot possibly be as intense. You can't develop the same levels of dislike and hatred that you do if you're playing somebody in football once every 5 years, mm-hmm. or in basketball, you might not play them twice in the same year for a long stretch. So you might not visit their arena, but once or twice in your whole college career as a player. All of these cultural things were watered down. That was inevitable. It was discussed at the time, but you know the rules. When push comes to shove, follow the money. So even though some of these negatives were foreseeable, even in the moment, the almighty dollar usually wins, and the trade-offs were considered worthwhile. Most of those expansion votes were not close calls. They were overwhelmingly in favor of expansion because those athletic directors had bills to pay, and those university presidents who actually made the votes had even bigger bills to pay. And expansion made paying those bills that much less difficult.
So let's get into this year's ACC tournament. How weird is it going to be watching a mediocre Duke team and an below average Carolina team playing in this ACC tournament, probably being the 7, 8, 9 seeds when they're usually 1, 2?
It's this weird. Since 1987, when I first started covering the Atlantic Coast Conference, I have never said the sentence that I am about to say to you. It is March, and Duke and Carolina are both on or near the NCAA tournament bubble as they head to the ACC tournament. Now, that has happened for one or the other in a given year over my 34 years. Rarely for either one, never for both in the same season. And that's just the reality as we speak. And it's not only weird for Duke and Carolina, Carter, it's weird for the league in a more general sense, because I looked up these crazy stats. The last time, there's still a chance for the ACC to get a 1 seed or a 2 seed. Mm-hmm. but the NCAA tournament started being seeded in 1979, even before an old guy like me started covering this league. Would you believe that since seeding became a thing in 1979, there is one and only one year that the Atlantic Coast Conference didn't have a 1 seed or a 2 seed, and it was 1990. That's once since 1979. At the moment, unless Florida State gets on a roll, the ACC is not going to have a 1 or a 2 seed this year. So that's a once in forever. And another broad one is the last time the ACC finished a college basketball season without a team in the final top 10 of a major poll was 1960, before even I was born. That's 61 years ago. Now, who knows, maybe FSU or Virginia or somebody else does finish in the top 10. So those two are kind of ... to be determined. But as this league heads to Greensboro for the ACC tournament, you're going to have probably 8 of the 15 teams needing to win it to get the automatic bid just to get to the NCAA tournament. You only have Florida State and UVA even close to the top tier of college basketball. And then you do have some nice stories at Virginia Tech and Clemson. You do have some intriguing teams at Louisville and North Carolina, even Georgia Tech. We'll see what Duke and Syracuse do here down the stretch. But so will it be magically 9 teams in the end that make it from the ACC? Because that's a really good number. That would tie the league's all-time record. So we'd go from 3 months of people beating up on the ACC to, wow, they tied their all-time record with 9 bids. Or it could be something as small as 6 maybe. But anything in that 7 and 8 range, if you're a 15-team league, that's not bad. The oddity this year is not the depth of the ACC with 7 or 8 or who knows how many bids. The oddity is that there are no super heavyweights. And when you're the league that's winning the national title half the time, I mean, truly half the time, the Atlantic Coast Conference has been hanging banners in men's basketball. When you go to entering a tournament without maybe any of the top 10 teams, that is where the anomaly lies right now for the ACC and men's basketball.
Anyway, Duke makes the tournament without having to win the ACC tournament.
I do think there's still a chance if they
don't tease me, David.
If they beat Carolina, obviously that's a step in the right direction to end the regular season. And then so much depends on which teams they face in Greensboro. You're not going to get power points from your first opponent there in all likelihood.
Well, I wanted to bring this up to you.
It depends on what the bracket looks like.
Because if Syracuse beats Clemson this afternoon and then Duke beats Carolina, we're going to see Duke Carolina at noon on Wednesday in the ACC tournament.
That's true. At that point, of course, you're still building your resume by beating Carolina, but at that point, they're also a bubble team, right? So, yes, it's good to beat them, but you're not really going to get your bigger wins until later in that bracket. And even that assumes that the higher seeds advance. You never know who you're going to face later in the bracket. So it's a guessing game in a way that Mike Krzyzewski just hasn't had to deal with. I mean, even 1995, the last time Duke didn't make the big dance, that was Coach K's bad back year. So he wasn't even at the ACC tournament, and they weren't a bubble team either. But that's how rare it is. I mean, these are 2 of the greatest programs in the history of college basketball, not an exaggeration in the slightest. And it's, to me, the greatest rivalry in the history of college basketball, one of the greatest in the history of American sports. It's just taken a different flavor this year. Doesn't mean the people around here care less. They still care a lot. But whereas most years the Duke-Carolina matchups are among the most watched regular season college basketball games in the entire country. Some years they're 1 and 2. And that's because the rest of the nation cares too in those years. I don't think the rest of the nation cares quite as much this year. And it's just because neither team is all that good. They're okay. And on some nights they look pretty good. But, you know, who's the best player at Carolina? Whoever you think it is, he might barely make the 15-man All-ACC team. When's the last time you said you weren't sure Carolina had one of the top 15 players in the Atlantic Coast Conference. I would argue Armando Bacot is an all ACC guy, but he's probably third team.
Yeah.
And at Duke, it's not the usual parade of super freshmen. There's no Zion and R.J. Barrett on this team. There's no Jahlil Okafor, or there's no Vernon Carey Jr. or Marvin Bagley or Brandon Ingram. I mean, you know, Jalen Johnson might still turn out to be a first-round NBA draft pick, but he's not even on the team. And, you know, the only elite player at Duke right now is Matthew Hurt.
Yeah, for sure.
He'll be an all-ACC player, but I don't think he's he's not a serious ACC Player of the Year candidate. He's brilliant offensively, but he's actually part of Duke's problem defensively. And so that's, you know, there are other better candidates, I believe. So, yeah, add it all up. It's just weird in every way. But I guess you could say it's fun at the same time, because unpredictability has its fun, just like following super heavyweights has its fun.
All right, so before I let you go, give me a dark. I should have asked you before to give you a little time to prep, but let's do it on the spot. Who's your dark horse to win the ACC tournament? It feels like a crapshoot.
Not as much as I respect what Clemson has done this year under Brad Brownell. I think he's an ACC Coach of the Year candidate. I don't think the Tigers have enough offensive firepower to get it done. As much as I love Jose Alvarado and Moses Wright at Georgia Tech, I don't think they have the depth or the coach to get it done. I'll go with Virginia Tech as a dark horse. I'm assuming you would not accept either Florida State or Virginia as a dark horse, because they're the top two. The fun thing about Virginia Tech is, A, they play some of the best defense in this league. Virginia deservedly deserves most of those defensive accolades because of what Tony Bennett has done there over the last decade. But these Hokies are really good at that end of the floor. Two, they're well coached by Mike Young, another
unbelievable coach.
No doubt. Brilliant at Wofford for all those years. Nobody should be surprised that he's still a great coach just because he jumped to the ACC. So great defense, good coaching. And unlike some of these other teams where I like Clemson, I like Georgia Tech, they just run out of players at some point. They don't have enough depth to win, I don't think, a tournament over, you know, the 4 days that are usually required. The Hokies don't have a lot of depth in the post, where their Wofford transfer, Keve Aluma, has become an all-ACC player. Remember, last year the Hokies had guards. They just had nothing inside, and that's why they were just not a very good team overall. Well, most of those guards are back. So now you have Aluma inside, and although they haven't shot the three as well lately, mainly because ACC defenses have scouted them. Jalen Cone and Hunter Couture can flat out light it up. You know, Tyrese Radford is back from his suspension and a really good player. Wabisa Beatty is not a scorer, but he's a good leader and a really good defender. There's just something about their combination of defense, coaching, and depth that, if I had to pick a dark horse, let me go with Virginia Tech. And obviously that would be history-making because, you know, the Hokies have never won an ACC tournament. And I'll tell you what, man, as you get older, there aren't as many things because you feel like you've seen most things. There aren't as many things that, you know, can almost bring a tear to your eye emotionally, even as an objective journalist. But when I watched, you know, Jim Larinaga lead ACC relative newcomer Miami to its first ACC title, and remember the Canes still haven't won the football title and they're supposed to do that. Still haven't done that, but yet broke through in basketball, a sport that they abandoned at the Division I level decades ago, and now they're the ACC champions. Leonard Hamilton at Florida State, he's done it multiple times now, but a football school winning in basketball for the first time. To say that those young men, and even the old men, meaning the coaches, to say that they care about what for their schools are historic accomplishments, just beyond the personal pride that you and your teammates and your family would win, even if you're from one of the blue bloods, that extra layer, whether it's a dark horse like Virginia Tech, Clemson's never won the ACC basketball tournament, and they're an original member of this league, right? There is a beauty to that. There is a a spectacle to that. There's a human element to that kind of a thing. Who knows if it'll happen in Greensboro this year, but it's just part of what makes covering sports so much fun. You and I might love the X's and the O's and, dissecting games and coaches and athletes, but that human element, to me, that's the best part of life. That's the best part of sports. And it's one of the many things that makes me just cherish what I get to do for a living all the time.
All right, this is my actual last question.
Yeah.
So with NC State, it just seems like they're just staying at the same level constantly. They're always bubble every year. Is Kevin Keatts the guy that can take them out of that, or do they need to look elsewhere?
I think Kevin Keatts can take them out of that. He showed at UNC Wilmington that he has the ability over time, and actually pretty quickly at UNCW, to recruit his kind of players and build around athleticism on defense, to build around kind of diverse combo guards on the perimeter. He just doesn't have enough of those guys. And it's not like he hasn't aimed high, right? Some of his top signees have actually, jumped straight to professional basketball.
That's
whereas
true.
if they had stayed, maybe they could have been the difference between an NIT type resume or an NCAA tournament trip. I do think because he got the pack to the big dance in his first year there, and of course there was no big dance last year, I do think he's going to get more time. I do think he deserves more time. I like guys like Shaquille Moore in his freshman class. I love Manny Bates as a defender and a shot blocker, and he's becoming a well-rounded player. Jericho Hellums is another example of somebody who's improved quite a bit from his first day at NC State to what he is, I think, now as a junior. When you see individual player improvement, when you've seen him take them to the promised land in his first year, meaning the tournament, when you see him go on the road and beat Virginia and earn one of those ice cream trips, as the Wolfpack likes to say after big road wins, I think that combined with his track record, he helped Rick Pitino build a national champion at Louisville. He had one of the best prep programs in the country prior to jumping to college basketball. So I think the length and depth of his resume, including UNC Wilmington at the Division I level as a head coach, earns him a little more time to see if he can build a team in his image. I don't think we've seen any teams where the top 7 or 8 guys are all Kevin Keatts guys. That takes time, especially when you're recruiting in the shadow of Duke and Carolina. It's a hard job. It's a good job, but it's a difficult job. So I hope he'll get more time. I think he'll get more time. And I think he'll bring the pack back to the NCAA tournament.
Well, David, thank you so much. I had a ton of fun talking to you.
As did I.
I hope to have you on again sometime, maybe in person. So thank you so much. And anything to add?
Well, credit to you, Carter, because I do probably 500 radio, TV, or podcasts a year. I guess that was the number back when I was doing my own show. And I can tell you this, wherever you go in this industry, you ask great questions, which is always a sign of preparation. You have great knowledge, which is always a byproduct of passion and research. So I hope you and I will keep in touch, but I applaud you because you made this fun for me. And I can't say that every interview I do qualifies by that standard. So great work by you. I hope I lived up to your expectations as well. And I look forward to another visit down the road.
All right. Appreciate you, man.
Take care.